Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. I'm really excited because Sarah Dobish, who works for us, actually is our moderator for most of these evenings. She recommended this book to me recently to do a review on. And of course, the title seemed intriguing. It's The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. And I assumed it would speak really well to this trend that we see in our culture, in society, where we're seeking more and more relief from pain, more and more relief from discomfort, more and more creature comforts in our lives, and how wilderness therapy and this very model that we use at Evoke Therapy Programs is resisting that energy, that trend, that change, and getting into it. I just want to tell you, I love it when science catches up with our intuition, when science catches up to what our hearts already know. There's so much in this book that's rich. I love it because it's really scientific. If you are a parent or anybody for that matter interested in what wilderness therapy is and why we do what we do, I would highly recommend this book because he tells such a compelling story from a research perspective. And of course, he's a beautiful storyteller and shares a wonderful narrative woven throughout the book about a trip that he went on with a couple of guides. So tonight I'm going to share a lot of quotes from the book and then make commentary on it and relate it to the intervention of wilderness therapy, the activity of wilderness therapy. So with that, I'll go into this first quote. He says, but a radical new body of evidence shows that people are at their best, physically harder, mentally tougher, and spiritually sounder after experiencing the same discomforts our early ancestors were exposed to every day. Scientists are finding that certain discomforts protect us from physical and psychological problems like obesity, heart disease, cancers, diabetes, depression, and anxiety, and even more fundamental issues like feeling a lack of meaning or purpose. This idea that to challenge ourselves to be slightly uncomfortable, to be slightly stressed out from time to time can actually enhance our physical and emotional and spiritual well-being is I think something a lot of us who are drawn to this vehicle of wellness therapy know intuitively. But again, I love that the research clearly now shows it out. He cites several different renowned researchers, psychologists, doctors, people that work with the most popular and successful elite athletes in the country, those that have worked in the military and studied our veterans and their exposure to physical activity, to all kinds of nutritionists and folks who are studying what we eat, how we consume, how we treat our bodies, how our lifestyles affect all kinds of diseases, all kinds of things. And I think most importantly, for those that are considering a wilderness therapy idea, philosophy, or intervention, how they affect our mental health. So this is where he starts from. He says, I wasn't a completely new person, and I'd never be confused with Mr. Rogers, but I was more aware, which allowed me to see that I was still surrounded in comfort. I was marinating in the stuff, he says, except that these were less acutely destructive, but potentially more insidious forms of it. I had to take a look at my everyday life. I was comfortable, quite literally, every single moment. I awoke in a soft bed in a temperature-controlled home. I commuted to work in a pickup with all the conveniences of a luxury sedan. I killed any semblance of boredom with my smartphone. I sat in an ergonomic desk chair, staring at a screen all day, working with my mind and not my body. When I arrived home from work, I filled my face with no effort, highly caloric foods that came from Lord knows where. Then I plopped down on my overstuffed sofa to binge on television, streamed down from outer space. I rarely, if ever, felt the sensation of discomfort. The most physically uncomfortable thing I did, exercise, was executed inside an air-conditioned building as I watched cable news channels. And while his description of this hits both close to home and can feel very indicting, I think it's just natural. I mean, even during the pandemic, on the heels of the pandemic, one of the things that I've recognized recently in my own life, and I'll tell this personal story at the outset, was I was just sharing this with my daughter the other day as I've become more involved in an exercise routine, even as of late. I said to her, I fell so out of shape during the pandemic. I developed back problems. I developed a low grade depression for somewhere around a year and a half, which I feel like I'm nearly completely out of at this point. And I had reduced my exercise to almost nil. Sometimes I would go down and ride the exercise bike. But I looked at those first few months of the pandemic as a break. I was regularly active and exercising and traveling a lot before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, I thought, well, this will be a month or two, and this is a really good excuse to indulge myself and relax. And it wasn't until I had a routine MRI that I have to get for my multiple sclerosis every 6 months to make sure it's still contained and in remission, that they found that I had a bulging disc. And I realized I've been sitting on that couch so much, I'd felt it. I felt the discomfort, but I'd struggled with back pain all of my life, that I just kind of learned to ignore it, learned not to pay attention to my body. But there it was there on the MRI. And as I went to physical therapy, first I went to a doctor, and they said, before we do anything surgically, we always want to give you the chance to use physical therapy. So I went to physical therapy. And even in my first couple of visits, as I was describing to the physical therapist the pain and trying to get them to read the records that were sent by my doctor from the MRI, they said to me, essentially, we're just going to get you in shape. Yes, we'll focus on specific things that might structure and target the muscles around the area in your back that is compromised. But moreover, we're just going to get you exercising and get your core strength. Much of what we will do is something that anybody would do if they were doing functional fitness. And not long after that, I started getting into an exercise routine a little bit more. I had to travel. I had to put on clothes that didn't fit. I'm sure none of this is completely foreign to the people that are listening, but I had to get out back in the world. So I started exercising just a little bit. And then somewhere around December, it hit me as I was struggling to get out of the bed in the morning, uncomfortable with my new body that I had acquired or developed during the pandemic. And I said to myself, I'm just going to do it. I'm ready to do it. I've been ramping up slowly. But for the first time in my life, and that's to today, it's only been a few months. For the first time in my life, I said, I'm going to do it to feel better, not to look better, not to even reach some exercise goal. I've had long periods of successful exercise in my life, although I've struggled with self-medicating with food and a lack of activity at times. I've run 2 Ironman triathlons, about 100 shorter triathlons, and 7 marathons in my life. So I've had periods in my life where I was really in shape, but I had lost hope. And with that hope, that identity had come in, that this is just the way that it was going to be. And that lifted one morning. And I decided I was going to do it. I wasn't going to make excuses. My adult daughter, helped. And she said, Dad, just trust me. Even if you're working a full schedule, wake up and go to the gym at 6 a.m. and put yourself through a strenuous exercise. And I finally accepted her invitation, and I did just that. And I can tell you today, maybe 75, 80 days in to a really regular practice, my mental health is lifting, my mood is lifting, my depression has nearly been eradicated. My eating habits are better. And I want to say something for those of you who've struggled like I have with food or body image. I want to say something very clear. I haven't stepped on the scale but once. Because really, for me, the idea of exposing myself to something strenuous is its own reward psychologically. And of course, I'm going to be reading here that there are a lot of physical benefits. So I wanted to share that personal story in the context of all the science I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. Michael said, that the author said, I saw a choice. Option 1, do nothing, cling to complacency and the numbing lifestyle that would ultimately end badly, but allow me to keep drinking. All evidence until then suggested that nothing fixes a problem like the first drink. So again, he's dealing with substance, self-medicating with substances. Like a lot of children who come to our program, they might not qualify for the full diagnosis of addiction, but those things start to creep into us, start to build over time, start to calcify over time. And something provocative and challenging, like a wilderness adventure, can crack that open. Speaking about society today, we lack physical challenges, he writes, like having to work hard for our livelihoods. We have too many ways to numb out, like comfort foods, cigarettes, alcohol, pills, smartphones, and TV. We're detached from the things that make us feel happy and alive, like connection, being in the natural world, effort, and perseverance. Comforts and conveniences are great, but they haven't always moved the ball downfield in our most important metric, happy, healthful years. Perhaps existing only in our increasingly overly comfortable, overbuilt environment and always obeying our comfort drives has had unintended consequences and caused us to miss profound human experiences. There are conditions that humans evolved to live in and experiences that we were meant to have that are no longer germane to our lives. This has undoubtedly changed us, and not for the best. So this is universal. And I think the pandemic amplified all of these issues. All of us were cut off from our social contexts, which is a huge part of a lot of our mental health. You know, our sense of well-being, our sense of meaning is the relationships that we have. We were confined to our screens, even for any social contact that we had. And while the draw, the gravity to sit on that couch or stare at that screen is strong, like a lot of things that we're drawn to, it doesn't necessarily lead to our overall happiness. David Levari is a psychologist from Harvard University, and Levari recently conducted a series of studies to find out if the human brain searches for problems even when problems become infrequent or don't exist. This creep phenomenon, he calls it a creep phenomenon, applies directly to how we relate to comfort, said Levari. Call it comfort creep. When a new comfort is introduced, we adapt to it and our old comforts become unacceptable. Today's comfort is tomorrow's discomfort. This leads to a new level of what's considered comfortable. A chilly teepee, yurt, or simple cabin was once a luxurious respite from the weather, but now we can dial in our indoor temperatures to our exact specifications. One of the things that somebody said one time when visiting our program, a colleague that worked for the State Department in another life, and had spent many years in China, in primitive parts of the country, the non-industrial parts of the country. And one of the things she shared with me after a visit was the smiles on the kids' faces in the program, the sense of accomplishment and pride in what they were accomplishing, the light behind their eyes of their dirty faces was the same light that she saw in the Chinese culture, the rural culture, the farmers, those that lived in mud huts, she said. There's this idea, you know, it's really germane to our thinking sometimes, that once we get a certain comfort, once we get a certain technology, once we have that car, that house, that job, that relationship, that new level in our life, that we're going to be happy. But it's often in our challenges and our trials that we find a deeper meaning, which overrides any effect of happiness in our lives. You know, the idea that Viktor Frankl talked about in Man's Search for Meaning. The reason I love that book, the reason that book is a staple in our program, Viktor Frankl being a doctor who was a prisoner in the concentration camps, basically because arguably he had potentially the most dire of circumstances that a human being could be exposed to. Harsh conditions of abuse, torture, murder, genocide, the loss of loved ones, the death of people all around him. And he got to this point where he realized it was either give up or find meaning in his suffering. To alchemize our suffering, our struggle into something beneficial. And I think that's what intentional struggle can do for us. Exposing ourselves to challenges. You know, there's a very popular practice today about taking ice baths or taking ice showers. There is a physiological reality that intentionally exposing our bodies to stress and learning to breathe, learning to meditate, learning to relax in the face of harsh stressors like that can have lasting effects throughout the day, throughout our lives. We can extrapolate those principles. We'll talk more about that as I read on. Speaking of one of his guides, he says, William, they were going on a hunting trip, a very primitive hunting trip in Alaska, in the Alaskan outback. And he writes, William stood stoically near the spring wearing a short-sleeved t-shirt, stone dead to the temperature. Aren't you cold? I asked. Huh? He said, apparently unaware of the frost exiting his mouth, and the reply, cold? I said, pulling on the sleeve of my jacket. Aren't you cold? Oh, no, not really. I get that it's cold out, said William, but it doesn't bother me. I kind of like how it feels. I can usually wear a t-shirt down to 40 degrees. I remember when I first started in wilderness therapy and I saw these young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, coastal kids from Southern California where I grew up, these surfer kids. Almost a cliche, a caricature of what it meant to grow up in Southern California and surf culture. Watching these kids where I grew up come into the wilderness in the middle of winter against the elements and watching them for the first few days saying to me, literally and figuratively, I can't do this. I can't handle that. And I had one advantage over all the parents that sent their kids. I had the ability to stay objective in the face of their distress, making sure that they were safe, making sure that no harm was going to come to them, but allowing them to experience that distress. And then to watch them weeks later walk around in freezing temperatures without their jacket on by choice, having to be asked by the staff to put on their hats or put on their jackets. I can remember parents coming out complaining that there was a hole in the pant leg of their child, or that there was a tear in a sweater, and then calling out a new sweater, a new pair of pants, and having the child not put it on for 4 or 5 days. These kinds of experiences of intentionally challenging ourselves change us physiologically, spiritually, emotionally. One of the things that I hear folks who are opponents, critics of the work we do, a very common refrain is this refrain of hiking and making fire with sticks isn't therapy, is what they say. Here's what Michael Easter says about that. He says, I felt more alive than I had since my early days of sobriety, when I realized I had a whole new life ahead of me. My mind was quieter, my body abler. He talks about how, in the context of this challenge, that he had to reset his mindset. And that mindset, while very specific to being outside in a primitive living environment, that mindset extrapolated to all the rest of the challenges. And he would say, it was really there was nothing, you didn't need to read anything. You didn't need to be taught something. You didn't even need a therapy session. But you just needed nature and exposure. And a big piece in his book, in fact, maybe a third of it, talks about this specific idea of going back to what our ancestors had to do to survive, which included carrying a portion of their body weight. That carrying things, and I'll talk about that a little bit more with some of the research, was an important part of this experience. Over our species, hundreds of thousands of years, he writes, of evolution, Eliot said, it was essential for the survival to do hard stuff all the time, to be challenged. And this was without safety nets. These challenges could be from hunts, getting resources for the tribe, moving from summering to wintering grounds, and so on. Each time we took one of these challenges, we'd learn what our potential is. I believe people have innate evolutionary machinery that gets triggered when they go out and do really effing hard things, when they explore the edges of their comfort zone. He talks about this idea from borrowing from another culture, an Eastern culture, Far Eastern culture, something that he refers to as misogis. This idea of something really challenging and stressful. He says, misogis can show you that you have had this latent potential you didn't realize, that you can go farther than you ever believed. When you put yourself in a challenging environment where you have a good chance of failing, lots of fears fade away and things start moving. New research shows that depression, anxiety, and feeling like you don't belong can be linked to being untested. I'm going to read that again. New research shows that depression, anxiety, and feeling like you don't belong can be linked to being untested. So you must fail about half of the time. I asked. I've actually failed my last couple of masogis, Elliot said. He had a couple of rules with the masogi. The masogi, he said, had to be something that you had about a 50-50 chance of accomplishing. If it was too easy and your chances were 80 or 90%, it wasn't a masogi. If you had virtually no chance, it wasn't a masogi. But he drew the line around 50-50. That was rule number one, a 50-50 chance of completion, of success and failure. He said the second rule of masogi is you can't die. There's no dying involved. And so what I love about this idea is that in the context of a quest, of a walkabout that some primitive cultures do, of several rites of passages, there are no safety nets. The chances of dying are real and realized at times. But in the context of something like an invitation to a wilderness program or enrollment in a wilderness program, if a child is unwilling to do it, you have those safety nets. You have people around you that are making sure that you're okay. Speaking of rites of passages in Hero's Journey, for example, he writes, the young men of the Aboriginal people, Australian natives, who have lived on the island continent for some 65,000 years, went on walkabout. The person was toast if he hadn't prepared for the quest by practicing skills like building a shelter, hunting and foraging for food, learning which plants act as medicine, and anything else that he might need in order not to die. Or he'd come back into the camp a failure if he came back at all. But if the person made it, he returned to the tribe physically and mentally tougher and more capable with a greater understanding of the world and his place in it. I talked about this when I teach about wilderness therapy, that in more primitive cultures, even our own in North America, our own more primitive culture, that the lessons for life were inherent in life's activities. I took a class I've shared. I actually took the class twice. I had a goal to get straight A's in college and I got a B+. So I took it a second time, but I think it was the universe's idea, because I had no idea that wilderness therapy existed at that point in my career. And yet this course became the foundation of my understanding of the theory of wilderness therapy. And in this class, we talked about spirituality and housework. It was called Temporal Work and Spirituality in the Home is what it was called. And we talked about chores. We talked about things like ice cream or laundry or vacuuming. And basically what we learned is that nearly every modern convenience has allowed us to isolate more. There's a famous quote that I share where somebody from quoted in the I think it's the the Journal of Harvard Medicine. I might be getting that wrong, but the Harvard Journal, and she was saying, when I was younger, I used to shell peas with my children, and we would spend time talking and shelling peas. And she said, now I can buy them frozen, pre-peeled. But then she reflected and she thought, I'm going to have to find something to replace that activity, because more was being accomplished than just getting peas shelled. There was actually something relational, some mentoring, some connection that was happening at that time. I love the analogy of ice cream, because I had some experience with it when I was growing up, where we would make ice cream. We never had the one that was hand cranked, that had a hand crank. We had an electric one, but it was still tedious. But they draw back to this idea of making ice cream, that it would take a whole family. Somebody would have to mix the ingredients. Each family member would have to take a turn at the hand crank. Somebody would have to maintain the ice and the salt around the main container for the ice cream, and it would take hours to create. And then because everybody was always impatient, and in my family, we would end up eating this runny ice cream that had the consistency of slightly warmed over frozen yogurt, just past the frozen stage. And we absolutely found it delicious. And now, today, we buy, or even now today, since the last time I gave this lecture on wilderness therapy, now today, we have ice cream delivered to our house. We click a few buttons on a computer, somebody does the shopping for us, carries the groceries to our front door, and we have a half gallon of ice cream. And we have all this time to save. And what do? Typically, generally, we spend more time on screens or watching TV and not necessarily interacting. So part of what primitive cultures teach us, part of why even today Evoke is a primitive living nomadic model, is because we believe that the lessons are so much more effectively taught in the context of the struggles of primitive living. We have been tempted, and at some point may even change the model to be a more recreational adventure model because it markets better, frankly, because of parental guilt, because people aren't willing to do the hard thing, and parents are so easily compromised by their child's pains. I know that I am. I've always said the worst sound in the world is not just a baby crying, but the sound of your baby crying, my baby crying. That's the worst sound in the world, because we are so compromised that and unwilling to challenge it. We get tempted to change the model to something that's more marketable, when really we believe, and I've talked to other therapists who have moved from the primitive model to the adventure model, and they say it's so much more effective. Paired with quality, compassionate, non-shaming, non-punitive therapy, it's the most provocative and effective model I've ever seen creating change in adolescents and young adults. He talks about this idea of the hero's journey, something that Evoke Therapy Programs, my first book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, draws heavily from Joseph Campbell's work. This idea that in all these cultures, it's very common to have these ancient cultures. It's very common to have a rite of passage that involves extreme challenge and discomfort. And the rite of passage often separates the boys from the men, or the girls from the women. It's a coming of age ceremony. And Michael Easter in the book writes, variations of the Masogi myth exist through time and space. Greek, Mesopotamian, Buddhist, Norse, Christian, Hindu, and ancient Egyptian mythology all have some version of what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. The hero exits the comfort of the home for adventure. He's hit with a challenge. It tests his physical, psychological, and spiritual fortitude. He struggles, yet he manages to prevail. He returns with a heightened knowledge, skills, confidence, and experience, and a clearer sense of his or her place in the world. And research going back to the late 1800s proves that mere mortals benefit from epic physical trials. I used to teach this to the staff all the time. In running a wilderness therapy program, I would say, yes, there are clinical assignments. Yes, there's clinical work to do. Yes, we have a therapy overlay on top of the primitive small group living model that we use. But I said, even in cases where you might deem it a failure, if a client, a student as we call them, makes it through a full course of wilderness therapy, they are changed. Some of the kids that I would have graded, if I were grading, lowest on the scale, came away with the greatest sense of pride of having done something that very few people have done, would be willing to do. There's something that happens in this journey, and literally, very often in this rite of passage, this hero's journey, there is a venture out into the wilderness to confront the unknown. I was just talking to somebody recently about running Ironmans and marathons, and we were comparing notes. It's been a few years since I've run them. But we were talking about our experience, and we were both saying it was a spiritual experience. As an individual, without respect to my family, my children, which of course supersede this, the completion of my marathons and my Ironmans, my 2 Ironmans, was the greatest moment, the greatest days of my life. Somebody said to me, listening on to us, that was a great day. And I said, the whole day was great. And it wouldn't have been great if I just crossed the finish line. That wasn't the great part. The great part was the pain and the challenge, the years of sacrifice that led up to it. Although I don't like the term helicopter parenting helicopter parenting, I don't like that term because I think it's derogatory. I think it's demeaning to parents sometimes. It's really taking parents who have an anxiety issue, who have a lot of fear in their body. Most often parents who have damaged attachments themselves from childhood, often unexplored traumas. So, but in the context of this book, I'm going to use this term because he uses it. And I thought this was fascinating. Scientists at New York University identified 1990 as the beginning of helicopter parenting. The researchers say that when many parents stopped allowing their children to go outside unsupervised until they were as old as 16 due to unfounded media-driven fears of kidnapping. We've now deteriorated from helicopter parenting to snowplow parenting. These parents violently force any and all obstacles out of their children's path. Preventing kids from exploring their edges is largely thought to be the cause of the abnormally high and growing rates of anxiety and depression in young people. A study found that anxiety and depression rates in college students rose roughly 80% in the generation just after helicopter parenting began. Some states have even had to pass free-range parenting laws after some parents were being charged with neglect for letting their kids go outside alone. Powerful, powerful stuff. You know, as an attachment-based therapist and as somebody who's so drawn to the clinical field, to the psychological description of the human being, I've always said that the number one contribution you can make to your children is to see them, is to create what we call a secure attachment or a healthy attachment. And the research is pretty convincing on that matter, universally through all socioeconomic, cultural groups across countries and so forth. And that's true. But right next to that is this idea of letting children struggle, of letting children skin their knee, letting them experience failure, pain, setbacks. Just the idea of letting children fail is so important because really what we're so defended against as people, as adults, is failing. That's our guilt and our shame. We're reluctant to say, yes, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. My bad. Because we're so conditioned to think that the only acceptable outcome to any task, especially one as important as relationships and parenting, the only acceptable outcome is success. But I think there's a connection between really seeing your child and letting them struggle. Because so often what's happening is we're trying to protect our children from experiencing pain because they're going to be angry with us, because they're going to be disappointed that we let them down, that we dropped the ball, that we let them get hurt or let them fail. And again, because of our own unhealed trauma, because of the times that we were hurt as children, we want to prevent that hurt in our children. But the connection is you're not really seeing the child then. You're seeing yourself in the child. You're projecting onto the child your childhood. So you're trying to fix something in them that happened to you. And I think that's really critical to understand. That's really fundamental to our parenting issues, our parenting problems. One of the things I've said over the years, this is important. Nobody can compete with the love that you have for your child, at least with the vast majority of parents that I've ever met and ever worked with. You love your children more than anybody else. And nobody comes close. Not even I, the therapist who's caring for them, can come close. Nobody can come close to how much I and my wife love our children. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we see them clearly. Sometimes one of the reasons that I've appreciated being a therapist for young people and sending my children to coaches and mentors and therapists, and even in a couple of cases to therapeutic programming, is because I know that those people have a more healthy detachment with my child, to my child. They have enough distance to be able to see my child and not be triggered by their own traumas. I can sit and watch your child in tears. I can console them and comfort them. I can be with them in their pain much, much easier than I can with my own children. It's just the nature of virtually all the parents I know. And that's why I remember saying to my wife many years ago, when we were dropping one of our children off at a softball practice, that this really talented and energetic coach had set up for summertime. And she was debating or asking, should we stay and watch? And I said, we have to leave. We have to push the child out the door, let them figure out and navigate the social issues and the coaching issues. We trusted the coach. We have to be not even visible to them, because in moments of stress and trial, they'll be drawn to us. And because of our own issues, we'll be inclined to be pulled into that old pattern of rescuing, not comforting, consoling, but rescuing, taking away the barrier. And that's another reason why I don't like helicopter parenting or snowplow parenting, is because maybe it's because I have it and I can relate to it. Speaking of rites of passage, the book writes, Michael Easter writes, Anthony Stevens, a Jungian psychologist, has spent a career studying archetypes and rites of passage. He believes that these rites are fundamental to the human experience, a sort of crossing of a line in the sand that makes humans human. Although our culture has allowed rites of passage to atrophy with disuse, he wrote, there persists in all of us an archetypal need to be initiated. I love this phrase, the inward facing, these hero's journeys, these misogis, these rites of passage. Misogis, he writes, are inward facing, he said. A big part of the value proposition is that I'm going to do something that's really uncomfortable. I'm going to want to quit, and it's going to be hard not to quit because no one is watching. But I'm not going to quit because I'm watching. And then I can reflect back on how I was the only person watching myself, and I still rose to the occasion in a big way. There's some deep satisfaction in that. Joseph Campbell said that our stories, our movies, our novels, our books, our myths, all tell essentially, in so many ways, the same story, this heroic journey, this journey of invitation to the call, separation from normal life, from what is comfortable, and then the trail where we encounter dragons and magical helpers, mentors, teachers, and we end up in the dragon battle, killing and slaying the dragon, which is our fears, our shame, our self-doubt. And when we do, the dragon gives the treasure that it was hiding, that it was hoarding. And then we take that treasure and we go back to our community with a new wisdom. That's essentially the hero's journey, paraphrasing it in a very, very simple way. It's what you have been through, mom and dad. It's what those of you who are listening to this webinar and this podcast, I suspect, have had some contact with your own hero's journey. And one of the first impulses you have when you experience this elixir, this wisdom that in so many ways only comes from the trial and the discomfort outside of your comfort zone. When you experience that, one of the first things you want to do is share it with everybody else. And in many ways, that's what we're doing when we go to an Al-Anon meeting or a parenting session or a support group or to a podcast even. Is we sit elbow to elbow, virtually, sometimes literally, and we listen to others' stories and share our own. And we are buoyed up, we're lifted up in that wisdom, in that insight. There's a principle that he talks about in the book called toughening. Be careful with that, because again, it's not a punitive experience, but it's an idea of resiliency. This whole book is about resiliency, not just emotionally, but the research and the evidence for activity and discomfort and challenge, physical stress, emotional stress even, and the benefits from it are across the board. But one day, Siri, one of the people that he's studying with, one day Siri came upon some research on a concept called toughening. He explained it was this theoretical idea that being completely overwhelmed by negative, stressful things wasn't good. But it also theorized being totally sheltered shouldn't be optimal either. There should be some amount of stress that gives you optimal psychological and physical well-being. This is exactly, in a sense, exactly why people are talking about cold plunges. Now, one of the things I want to note about everything I've said so far is all of this is voluntary, so to speak. Everybody that he's writing about is going into this initiation intentionally, right? They're their own agent. And in our program, it's not always the case. Rarely the case, actually. Teens are being sent to our program, enrolled in our program by parent choice. But like a lot of things, I think everybody agrees that parents of children can and are obligated to require their children to do some things. It's the duty of a parent. And if a child is unwilling or unable or reluctant, then it's something that we can initiate them into, invite them into. And while there are some stories of children never forgiving their parents for it, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, because I think there's some important psychology about that dynamic. The vast majority of our clients talk about it as, at the very minimum, something that they're proud of having accomplished. But in many cases, something that they draw upon still. I cannot tell you the numbers of folks who write me letters, emails, and messages telling me of that very experience. Michael Easter goes on to write, compared to the people who had been sheltered their entire lives, the people who had faced some adversity reported better psychological well-being over the several years of the study. This was another study from Siri. They had higher life satisfaction and fewer psychological and physical symptoms. They were less likely to use prescription painkillers. They used health care services less. They were less likely to report their employment status as disabled. By facing some challenge, but not an overwhelming amount, these people developed an internal capacity that left them more robust and resilient. They were better able to deal with new stresses they hadn't faced before, said Siri. There were so many quotes and references to studies in this, I found myself highlighting something almost on every page. And I decided to pull out, of course, a portion of those. Of all the books that I've reviewed, maybe because this one is so far outside of the field that I typically study, which is usually very heavily psychologically based, whereas this is experientially based. This is one of my favorite books that I've read. Something that was inspiring, something that was confirming things that I saw with my own eyes. The first time I walked into a wilderness group in 1996. Something I saw in the experiences of the clients and the students that I saw work their way through the program. He talks a lot about carrying. He talks a lot about carrying backpacks, that our ancestors carried things, and that's a very, and that if we carry things and walk at a brisk pace, he has a name for it, that can be some of the most effective forms of exercise. The weight in the ruck is a specific kind of pack that is used in the military, and that a vet who came home developed a company where they built rucks so that people could ruck to work, ruck home, ruck to the grocery store, carry things in their backpack, and that carrying a certain significant amount of weight in this sack that one carries was one of the best ways to get strength, to build strength and cardiovascular fitness, but not put so much stress on the joints as high impact exercise like running does. The weight in the ruck is also the great equalizer. I love this quote. The weight in the ruck is also a great equalizer, which also makes it more social. McCarthy said, I ruck with my mom all the time. She takes 10 pounds, I take 50. We go the same speed but get the same effect. Outdoor physical activity with people, that's foundational. That's what Homo sapiens evolved to do, and that makes us happy. Sometimes when people hear about wilderness therapy and they find it to be so far out of the mainstream, they think it's fringe. I think to myself, how upside down have we become in our world where getting out into nature, primitive living, is fringe, and being in a room with I have 3 screens within arm's reach of myself right now. I have a climate controlled room, an office that I can control with my phone to the specific Fahrenheit degree that I want my room. I have an office chair that is ergonomically created that doesn't require me to use virtually any of my muscles to sit down like a stool might, or like a medicine ball, as some exercise experts suggest that we should use would require me to do. This is real life, right? And being in nature, living amongst the elements, is fringe. Like one of my favorite quotes, when we say we're disconnected from nature, we're saying we're disconnected from ourselves because we are nature. And like Joseph Campbell said, the goal is to match our beat with the heartbeat of nature, to match our nature to nature. So much has been lost. And I just want to be clear. I grew up in Southern California, Orange County, California. I owned a jacket a few times in my life because by the time I needed a jacket again, because we were going on a trip when we couldn't go very often because we didn't have a lot of money growing up. But by the time we would go on a trip where there would be weather where I would need a heavy jacket, I'd outgrown it. I didn't being out in nature, this kind of stuff, camping, wasn't in my experience. Michael Easter writes, in our pursuit of better living, we've allowed comfort to calcify our natural movements and strengths. Without conscious discomfort and purposeful exercise, a forceful push against comfort creep will only continue to become weaker and sicker. Yes, for the most part, our life expectancy has increased, but a lot of that is due to medicine. Most all of it is due to medicine, not because we are in better shape. I love this. I think this next quote is gold. He writes, this is why the scientists also believe that an outdoor test, like a backcountry hunt or summiting a mountain, can be better than more contrived challenges like organized urban marathons or team sports. One of the founders, creators of wilderness therapy, a quote that I often use when I'm teaching about the theory of wilderness therapy, said just that. He said, we found that when we created exercises that were contrived, team building exercises, that the overall impact of the intervention was diminished. And he goes on to teach, it was really just in the camping. It was really just in the small group living where the lessons were most vividly realized. I want to share a few other places where, from different perspectives and different sciences and different ideologies, where the same principles are being taught. This is from The Knight in Rusty Armor, the other book that is our staple for our students. This is an allegory of a knight who gets stuck inside of his armor, metaphorical of his defenses. But to get it off, he's told by the magician Merlin that he has to go on this quest. And 2/3 of the way through his quest, he confronts the dragon of fear and doubt. And he's aided by his 2 friends, Squirrel, who's a squirrel, and Rebecca, who's a bird. And after his first charge at the dragon, he turns around and gets burned in the butt. And as he's soaking his bottom in the cold river, this is the conversation they have. And here's the rest of the story. You were very brave, said Squirrel. Not too bad for a first try, added Rebecca. Astonished, the knight looked up from where he sat. What do you mean, first try? Squirrel said matter-of-factly, you'll do better when you go back the second time. The knight retorted angrily, you go back a second time. Remember, the dragon was an illusion, said Rebecca. And the fire coming out of its mouth, was that an illusion too? Right, answered Rebecca. The fire was an illusion too. Then why am I sitting in this brook with a burn behind? Demanded the knight. Because you made the fire real by believing the dragon is real, explained Rebecca. If you believe the dragon of fear and doubt is real, you give it the power to burn your behind or anything else, said Squirrel. They're right, added Sam. You have to go back and face the dragon once for all. Sam was the voice inside of his head as he was getting to know himself. Look, Sam encouraged, if you face the dragon, this is his deepest, most authentic self speaking. If you face the dragon, there's a chance that it will destroy you. But if you don't face the dragon, it will surely destroy you. And that's what happens with fear. That's my addition. Decisions are simple when there's really no alternative, said the knight. Reluctantly, he struggled to his feet, took a deep breath, and once again started across the drawbridge. The dragon looked up in disbelief. This was certainly a stubborn fellow. Back again, it snorted. Well, this time I'm really going to burn you. But it was a different knight who was marching toward the dragon now. A knight who chanted over and over, fear and doubt are illusions. The dragon threw gigantic crackling flames at the knight, time and time again. But try as hard as the monster might, it couldn't set fire to him. As the knight continued to approach, the dragon became smaller and smaller until it was finally no bigger than a frog. Its flame extinguished, the dragon began to spit small seeds at the knight. But these seeds, the seeds of doubt, didn't stop the knight either. The dragon became still smaller as the knight continued to advance determinedly. I've won, shouted the knight victoriously. The dragon could barely speak. Perhaps this time, but I'll be back again and again to stand in your way. And with that, it vanished in a puff of blue smoke. Come back whenever you want, the knight called after it. Each time you do, I'll be stronger and you'll be weaker. And this is our experience with fear. If we don't approach our fear, it looms larger in our life. If we run from it, it gets bigger. And if we approach it, it shrinks. And although we might overcome a specific fear or doubt in a given moment of time, the work is lifelong. It will be back again. And each new level will be met with a stronger and more vibrant version of ourselves. Another perspective, a podcast that I love, Work Life with Adam Grant, a very renowned, becoming more and more popular organizational psychologist. The name of the episode is How to Trust People You Don't Like, Work Life with Adam Grant. It was broadcast originally March 28th, 2018, Series 1, Episode 5. The description of it says this: astronauts on the International Space Station live in capsules together for months. And yes, they can get on each other's nerves. A crew of astronauts from different countries and the wilderness trainer who was called in for an emergency intervention share fresh insights about handling conflict and building trust. And here's a quote specifically from the episode, from the transcript. This couldn't have happened if they didn't build trust. How do you build trust in your workplace? You do things that help people like each other. Company parties and picnics, softball games, team dinners. But liking your coworkers isn't all it's cracked up to be. Research suggests that when people go to professional mixers, they don't really mix. They just end up hanging out with their existing friends. At company parties, people mostly just get closer to the colleagues who are similar to them. And those people, the ones you like most, odds are you rely on them more than you should. Think about the last time you reached out to a colleague for everyday advice, help, or ideas on solving a problem. Who did you go to? In a study at a tech company, it turned out that people went to the colleagues they liked, regardless of their competence. I found something similar in a hospital. When nurses wanted a second opinion on a diagnosis, they often went to colleagues they felt most comfortable with instead of the true experts. How much do I like this person is the wrong question to ask about a teammate. The right question is, how much can I count on this person? If you're an astronaut, that's a life and death question. So NASA has a way to build trust with new crews like Apollo's. They send them out into the wilderness. Again, there's nothing that can quite do the job of putting somebody in a vulnerable, difficult, challenging situation, exposing them to hardships where trust in each other and in the different strengths is paramount to success. There's nothing that is as effective as that. Our own, and this was also studied by Harvard University and NASA. Our brightest minds have realized that the way to bring these teams together is to give them a primitive living wilderness experience. Not adventure therapy, not rappelling, not white water rafting and horseback riding, but put them in a desert, put them in a wilderness area, and have them get from point A to point B. Again, if you want to read more about this, How to Trust People You Don't Like, Work Life with Adam Grant, March 28, 2018. Just today, this is the third venue. Just today, I have the date on here. It says February 14th, and it was sent to me first time this morning. A friend sent me an article from the New York Times. It was in the New York Times yesterday about $1 and was set to make many, many 34 years old, leaving millions of dollars on the table. And he decided to buy a boat and to learn to sail around the world, or all over the world. I shouldn't say around the world, but around the world. And a quote from the article says, in the moment of the stress and the challenge, you're terrified and you want to be as far away from danger as possible, he said. But once it's over, you appreciate where you're at more. There's this euphoria that comes over you when the storm clouds part. It's like holding your breath underwater and then coming back to the surface and taking up that full first scope of air. So since we don't live on farms, since we don't have to work for our food, since our parents are professional accountants and bookkeepers and doctors and attorneys and police officers, we don't have a connection to the struggle for living. You don't have to teach a child growing up on a farm. You don't have to teach them the law of the harvest, that idea of what you reap is what you sow, because it's inherent in the lesson. You don't have to teach folks in a primitive tribe what it means to belong, because if you don't work together and belong together and work together, you can't sustain life. And what often happens in these primitive tribes, their myths, their religion, the legends are all together with the lessons for survival. Same thing happens out in our wilderness program. And this is where the psychology comes in. I wrote this in The Journey of the Heroic Parent in the preface. I was talking about this idea of adventure therapy. And I wrote this. Ours is not an adventure therapy program. Evoke is not an adventure therapy program, replete with rappelling, mountain biking, or whitewater rafting. While play is an essential part of a balanced life, the use of recreation as a principal modality often serves to soothe parents' guilt when sending their child to a therapeutic program. Adventure therapy can be effective, but if the issue of parental guilt is not addressed, the family will stay stuck in old patterns. In the book Nurture Shock, Bronson and Merriman address the pitfall of an increasing trend of parents replacing hard work with recreation. This trend, they suggest, ensures everybody is happy, but only in the short term. Parents feel less stress, guilt, or personal discomfort, and with their kids entertained and distracted, parents survive to fight another day. Any parent, I wrote, can relate to these motives. I know I've had them. I mentioned earlier that we didn't have a lot of money growing up. My mother did not overindulge me, but it wasn't because she had good boundaries. It's because she had no money. I had to put myself through college. In fact, during one semester, I loaned her money from my student loan that she paid back to me a couple of weeks later. And I cannot tell you the numbers of parents that I've worked with over the years. It's in the many, many hundreds who have said to me, I grew up really struggling, putting myself through school, putting myself, getting a job early, working hard as a means for survival, as a means for getting what I wanted out of life. And then when I became a parent with enough means, enough resources, enough money, I sought to take away all of the challenges from my children. And parents have told me this over and over again. And I think it's very difficult not to repeat that pattern because again, we're looking at our childhood. We're looking at the pain. We're looking at the discomfort of not having enough. And we're trying to fix that in our children. And the pendulum, obviously, we know this. I know this. For me, I've made all these mistakes with my children, more or less. I've tried to make the road smoother for them. And as we learn in Al-Anon, the goal for parenting is not to carpet the world, but to help our child make their moccasins so they can walk through the world as it is. This is one of the last quotes in the book toward the end. I wrote on this as a title for this slide, Wilderness or Therapy. And Michael Leisha said, who needs to chat up a $100 an hour therapist when there are long, quiet, empty trails waiting to be walked? I teach the staff, wilderness is the therapy. You know, staff would say to me, because when we started our wilderness program, we really put the therapy in wilderness therapy in 1998 when we started. We changed the field. We really did. And we inserted highly trained, well-equipped therapists that manage everything and did a lot to advance the field. But sometimes that emphasis came at a cost. When I was training staff in those many early years, they would say, we don't have enough time in the winter. So much time is taken up with foot checks and hydration and cooking and cleaning and staying warm. And we don't have enough time for the therapy. To which I would respond and remind them, that is the therapy. And yes, rubbing sticks, your student is not going to need to, hopefully, ever need to make fire by rubbing sticks together to make a Bojo fire. They will have water accessible to them all the time. They'll have a plethora of food options and choices and climate-controlled shelter to live in throughout their life. But you can take those lessons, just like any challenging experience, and you can extrapolate them to the rest of your life. So what is the take-home? The take-home is that wilderness therapy is hard. That's the point. I don't want to apologize anymore. It needs to be really good therapy. It needs to be non-punitive. It needs to be compassionate. It needs to be trauma-informed. And when I hear people say, well, you're taking kids with trauma and you're putting them in a stressful situation, wilderness therapy is, according to many experts, the very therapy that is most effective with with veterans of war who have PTSD, is to go out into the wilderness. Wilderness therapy requires intentionality. Whereas you and I can take for granted, when I go out in the field for a couple of days, I wipe food on, if I spill something on my clothes, I just kind of wipe on my clothes. You can't do that if you have to live out there. You'll attract animals. Your clothes will become unwearable in a few days. I remember years ago, I was having a discussion with my staff, and one of my students walked up and said, do I have to take a bath today? And the staff said, yeah, it's the rule. And he said, but I'm just, it's windy and we're in the desert. I'm just going to get dirty later. And the staff was just about to talk him into it. And I said, just empathize. Just tell him, it's hard. And we said that to him. The student walked away and took his bath. You can't take for granted anything in the wilderness. You can't be lazy building your shelter or you will get rained on. If you don't pack your pack with some knowledge and skills about how to pack your pack, your hike is going to be uncomfortable. If you don't wear your pack correctly, if it's leaning to one side or ill-fitting, it won't work. Everything becomes intentional. It essentially becomes a vehicle for mindfulness. When so much of our lives is about distracting and self-medicating and not being present. And all of the comforts afforded to us that we all seek for allow us to numb out like that. Wellness requires intentionality, problem solving, effective communication in the group, conflict resolution, delay of gratification, frustration tolerance, and interdependence. All things that I think virtually every parent wants virtually every student, every child to learn. It is a rite of passage. It's difficult and uncomfortable, but you come out of it a bigger person. It's a place to spend time with yourself and find out who you are, what you're made of. Your weaknesses are exposed in wilderness. If you have poor communication skills and poor conflict resolution skills, it doesn't matter what you say in therapy and the workbooks and how well you are at quoting the 12 steps, you will be in conflict with your peers. And it also illuminates your strengths and they become more realized. And again, it's healthy sun, it's sleep, it's food that's healthy, it's activities, movement, exercise, mental focus, all while being unplugged, digitally detoxed, and away from screens and social media. And again, I just want to say in conclusion, I felt like this book was written for wilderness therapists, well, written for wilderness therapy programs. And at a time in our history, after having done it for 27 years, when there's some of the noise out there in the media about wilderness therapy and what it is, it's a refreshing reconnection to our roots. We always have to do better. We always have to look at our practices. Like I said, it has to be compassionate, smart, intentional therapy. We have to involve mom and dad. We have to address the entire system. That's another thing that wilderness that we did when we started is we brought the family in right away, immediately, when nobody was doing that. We have to help the parents in this process and not just have them sit idly by at home. That's why you're listening. That's why you're watching. Because you are invested in becoming a part of the entire change. And in the end, as with everything, the challenges, the difficulties that we all face reveal a larger version of ourselves. The hero comes back having bled and broken and struggled and cried and sweated. The hero comes back a more vibrant, bigger version of themselves. All right, folks. I'll go over upcoming activities. For those of you watching live, you can get your cameras on your phones open if you want to click on any of the images here or shine your camera on any of the images, and the respective web page will come up. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. Our new programming that we've started on February 24th, I think there might be one spot left. I'm hosting a all-day parenting workshop called Concert Parenting, 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. with an hour for lunch. Those are Mountain Standard Times. On May 26th, I'm going to be teaching a masterclass on attachment-based therapy for therapists and those that work in the therapeutic field. If you are a parent and you're just interested in the theory, you're welcome. Just know that I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it in the context of parenting. You'll have to make that kind of translation and extrapolation yourself. And then on June 23rd through 25th, I'm going to be hosting a Finding You weekend outside of London in the UK. So if you're there or you want to make a trip there and combine it with a wonderful self-help opportunity, June 23rd through 25th at a beautiful location that we've hosted at before. Just email intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, the next available Finding You is February 22nd. followed by March 22nd. We also have an online option on March 3rd. These online options are a third of the price, about half of the time, and you don't have to travel. So if resources are an issue, an online option is a fantastic option. We also have custom finding connection for couples and finding family sessions. You can contact intensives at Evoke Therapy for more information or to schedule or to inquire. We have support groups for current and alumni families of our wilderness program. February 16th, that's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering. We also have one alumni only per month, folks that are a little bit farther along in the process. February 28th at 6:30 p.m. is the next offering for our alumni only parent support group. And then we have once a month an intensive program. March 14th at 6 p.m. is our next offering for the intensive support group. Contact Sarah D at evoketherapy.com. That's SARAD, the letter D, at evoketherapy.com, or go to our family involvement page, or look through the QR code. We have coaching services available for individuals, parents, couples, and families. These are our therapists that are trained in our attachment-based model who do virtual coaching. I'll just read some of these. Anywhere from psychedelic therapy integration to crisis and faith or spirituality, guilt and shame related issues, LGBTQ related issues, parenting and family dynamic issues, wraparound services, leaving and transitioning from treatment, any of those options, stage of life issues. We also have a Pursuits Adventure Trip available that's custom designed for families or young adults. Think therapy light or sober fun. These are custom designed anywhere in the world. We have a lot of activities in Southern Utah, so you can come out for 3 days in between programs, after program, to reconnect to your work, led by our therapeutic wellness staff. Also can be combined with a therapist. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com to learn more or to inquire. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also search for RefugeRecovery.org, which is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of a dependence on a higher power, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has local classes and chapters in your community with free resources and education. All these broadcasts are available on your favorite spot, on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, or you can go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Finding You. You can also watch these rebroadcasts on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can follow Evoke Therapy programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find our intensives program on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content uploaded from our staff and therapists several times throughout the month. If you want to give back to people, for people that can't afford therapy, our 3 charitable partners include ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. My next broadcast will be next Tuesday, the 21st. I'll be having a live Q&A. Any questions that are left over from tonight, you can always send in questions, requests, suggestions. You can request copies of slide decks like tonight's if you want, because there's so much content on it and such great quotes. So if you want to have that on your computer, you can request a slide deck at any time. Just email webinar@evoketherapy.com for any of those requests, comments, or questions. All right, folks, I hope this is a helpful point of contact. It was an exciting book, The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. Thank you, Sarah, for recommending it. I absolutely loved reading it, was fascinated by all the research, and he's a really great storyteller. For those that you love, and for those that love you, thank you for attending and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday. Take care. Bye-bye.